Everything you thought was true is disintegrating. Beneath the carefully selected posts, Instagram smiles, and polished public appearances, a story has apparently been boiling. One of deliberate silence, treachery, and secrecy. Shekinah has come up and disclosed the truth about her relationship with T. Yes, I am. Facts that individuals who valued image over reality had long hidden, twisted, and carefully controlled. Made references to private discussions and delicate times in previously released video that were never meant for public access. Tiny Harris's violent response was triggered by a physical and symbolic interaction. However, despite speculations circulating and 50 Cent hinting at a documentary that may reveal these dynamics, no public reckoning occurred. Until now. Shekinah has chosen to reclaim the narrative and reveal what was always known in private. Power struggles, deceptive tactics, leverage, and tenuous alliances shaped everything from loyalty to reputation. These are serious rumors. This is purportedly a methodical breakdown, a dissection of the layers that exposes patterns of control, influence, and moral compromise. The repercussions are just beginning now that every gesture, expression, song, and unwritten rule has been made public. Shekinah and T's relationship, at first glance. Yes, I am. Appeared flawless, an image of dedication, self-assurance, and calm composure. Public appearances, carefully crafted interviews, and social media posts portrayed as a solid, reputable, and seemingly indestructible alliance. Tiny Harris's strengthened the narrative as gatekeeper and matriarch by creating an image of unflinching power, demanding respect, and ensuring that her family and close circle adhered to the rules of loyalty. As they gobbled up the images, videos, statements, and fans took what they saw as fact. But beyond this glossy exterior are layers that tell a very different story. The discussions that were kept out of the public eye purportedly revealed tension, manipulation, and repeated betrayals of trust, weakening the impression of togetherness. Scenes that compromised the plot were hinted at in the previously circulated but never fully contextualized leaked material. Shekinah and T's intimate interactions, whispered conversations, and secret gestures. Yes, I am. Became evidence in a story that the public had only heard about in passing. There was more to Tiny's physical aggression during the altercation than just an emotional outburst. It was the outcome of a trend. Rather than a single act of betrayal, it is believed that she responded to a series of calculated acts, subtle betrayals, and perceived transgressions that had accumulated over time. This meeting, which was partially caught on camera, exposed fissures that had always been beneath the surface and broke the carefully constructed feeling of control. The shadow of 50 Cent's implied documentary hung big even prior to this violent event. According to reports, the study claimed to look into the connections between T. Yes, I am. And Shekinah, including the private film and hidden behind-the-scenes conversations. Tiny's quiet at the time was interpreted by some as a purposeful evasion, while others regarded it as astonishment or an inability to confront the results in public. Regardless of the goal, the delayed answer caused the plot to proceed without her help, and the power dynamics shifted little but substantially. As conjecture intensified in the absence of a public statement, fans began to view every post, every subtle gesture, and every interaction through the lens of suspicion and moral inquiry. It is significant that 11/11 Shekinah decided to come out at this particular moment. It is described as a recovery of agency, an assertion of control over the long manipulated narrative, and a refusal to allow others to determine her story. The disclosure of her relationship with T. Yes, I am. Reframes the public's image, taking into account the intricacies of personal boundaries, devotion, and affection. What was once believed to be flawless cooperation or everlasting devotion is today a dynamic tableau of strategy, compromise, and conditional trust. Every private moment revealed, every dynamic revealed, is believed to represent a series of interactions where love, devotion, and support were paired with leverage, influence, and strategic placement. Tiny Harris reacted viscerally to the video right away. It was purportedly both a defensive mechanism and an act of authority. By physically confronting Shekinah, she confirmed her position in the hierarchy of relationships, asserted control, and set boundaries. But rather than being driven solely by emotion, this violent act was planned. Every gesture, word, and action conveyed light messages to both the attendees and the wider audience who would later catch glimpses of the altercation. Underlying weakness, fear, and the intentional exhibition of dominance are juxtaposed with the complexity, anger, and authority. Tiny's response demonstrates how, in this ecosystem, personal betrayal is constantly connected to performance, image, and strategic dominance. Throughout the conversation, Shekinah, on the other hand, carefully balances alertness and control. She allegedly knew that a response might change public perception, affect existing power dynamics, and either increase or decrease consequences. In her attempts to navigate the issue without provocation, she exhibits a thorough understanding of the stakes, the negotiation of authority, the maintenance of reputation, and the management of narrative. Her measured responses, which blend planned restraint, tactical disclosure, and influence preservation, provide the audience a peek of the survival techniques she has been employing for years. The timing of this revelation is critical. The combination of previously rumored documentary release, leaked material, and the ensuing encounter creates a narrative pressure cooker. It was claimed that what appeared to be isolated incidents of conflict were actually part of recurring behavioral patterns. Tiny taking the lead, Shekinah using her negotiating skills, and T. Yes, I am. Maintaining a selectively engaged and stabilizing presence. Each actor navigates a complex web of expectation, loyalty, and risk where perception is currency and exposure has consequences that extend beyond interpersonal relationships to include reputation, industry influence, and public scrutiny. As the narrative progresses, the cracks in the polished public facade become apparent. It was said that careful curation, selective disclosure, and purposeful boundary enforcement were necessary to create the appearance of harmony, loyalty, and unquestionable control. The once admired unity of the audience is now depicted as a fragile framework upheld by image, silent compromise, and manipulation. The altercation that ensued after the video was made public is not out of the ordinary. They are external signs of deeper, systemic forces at play, an introduction to the unraveling that is just beginning. The fight between Shekinah and Tiny Harris wasn't an isolated incident. It was clearly the result of years of skillful leadership, subtle manipulation, and calculated maneuvering. It is claimed that what the public perceived as a single act of treachery was actually the outcome of persistent patterns. Every interaction had an underlying power hierarchy, intent, and repercussions. Tiny's physical aggressiveness and control over the conflict were not just emotional. It was transactional, a means of taking back control in a setting where perception dictated reality. 2222 Each gesture upheld limits, reminded witnesses of past transgressions, and maintained a narrative that loyalty, obedience, and compliance were non-negotiable. It is said that Shekinah's position in this dynamic was never stable. Her apparent loyalty to T. Yes, I am. A. The Harris family worked in an environment where silence meant survival and public discretion, equated to continued power. In an environment that rewarded strategic acquiescence and penalized mistake, small gestures, cautious looks, measured reactions, and restrained retorts served as navigational aids. The published footage revealed a constant tension even though it was private and intimate. Private relationships are shaped by reputation, leverage, and the careful balancing act of advantage in addition to love and trust. Each conversation had weight, each pause carried meaning, and each implicit expectation supported a framework that regulated behavior. Repeated acts had created a pattern of intentional impact. According to reports, Tiny's reaction escalated in direct proportion to perceived threats. When boundaries are crossed, even accidentally, intimate moments are misinterpreted, or a small act of rebellion occurs, a cascade of corrective actions are triggered. Her role as the network's guardian, enforcer, and moral judge was reinforced by each corrective action. Loyalty, love, and friendship were not unqualified. They required upholding well-manicured looks, abiding by unspoken rules, and conforming to customs. As a result, the battle with Shekinah was the latest in a series of ceremonial debates where authority was contested, confirmed, and maintained. Power imbalances were made worse by T's presence. Yes, I am. Whose strength acted as a stabilizer and silent arbiter. It is said that his selective involvement allowed him to exert authority without overt interference. Despite their public portrayal as a balancing or mediating force, their private behavior demonstrated a deliberate strategy. Keep your leverage and reputation intact, let the tension build, and refrain from meddling too much. By permitting Tiny's violent response, he reinforced the hierarchy by defining acceptable behaviors, acceptable transgressions, and those that would result in punishment. In this ecosystem, silence was never neutral. It served as a strategic tool for influence, a planned tool for negotiation, and a means of strengthening power structures. The released footage supposedly elevated the stakes considerably. Previously private moments become evidence of relational dynamics, exposing patterns of intimacy, moderation, and compromise. Tiny's violent outburst, which was partially captured on camera, transformed a private issue into a public spectacle, forcing bystanders to deal with inconsistent behavior and appearance. Shekinah reframed previous speculation and strengthened her control over the story by sharing her personal perspective and eventually took the lead in interpretation. What had been rumors, conjecture, and selective leaks became a deliberate, self-directed revelation. Was abruptly brought to the attention of the public after being hidden. In this case, silence was a strategy. It is argued that prior instances of restraint were intentional decisions made to maintain access to power networks, avoid escalation, and preserve reputation. By postponing a response, Shekinah was able to avoid unnecessary provocation while retaining leverage, ensuring that the disclosure would have the biggest possible impact. A system where confrontation, authority, and emotional outbursts were common behaviors was reinforced by Tiny's constant assertions of dominance and Ti's selective passivity. Maintaining influence, establishing authority, and arranging the environment in line with established hierarchies are some of the purposes of each act of restraint or escalation. Behavior patterns extended beyond interpersonal conflicts. They reflected systemic dynamics in an ecology built on perception, leverage, and image. It is said 3333 that love, loyalty, and trust act as control mechanisms and currency simultaneously. Every decision was transactional, every act of compliance or disobedience was examined for its broader ramifications, and every performance, public or private, was assessed for its impact. Tiny's physical assertiveness, Shekinah's measured restraint, Ti's selective engagement, and all illustrated the recurrent power dynamics that governed both personal and professional interactions. The leaked footage also demonstrated how strategy was prioritized over feeling. Even the closest connections, it is said, were managed with concern for the consequences. Leverage could be applied through touching gestures. Alignment may be indicated by closeness, and boundary violations may lead to intentional correction. Transparency was rare, loyalty was conditional, and emotional expression was tightly controlled in this environment. The conflict adhered to these established patterns even if it was intense. An outburst that served as both a performance and a kind of punishment, reinforcing hierarchy and making the stakes obvious to all onlookers. Into the Part ultimately draws attention to a horrifying reality. Shekinah, Tiny, and Ti never had a strictly intimate relationship. They were locations where influence, leverage, and strategic control came together with loyalty, emotion, and image management. Every glance, music gesture, and exchange reportedly contributed to a broader system in which reputation was preserved, authority was defended, and power was continuously negotiated until exposure, both purposeful and inadvertent, forced the truth into the open, leaving no corner unaffected. Shekinah, Ti, and Tiny Harris are all a part of a far larger network than any one fight. It is claimed that these exchanges are not isolated. Control, power, and image are all intertwined in this well-organized industry environment. Opportunities, alliances, and perceptions can be altered by every action, statement, or hesitation. Public appearances, social media posts, and media coverage are all purposefully selected instruments used to highlight specific discoveries, repress uncomfortable facts, and bolster narratives. In this context, a private conflict is never just personal. It becomes a channel for systemic consequences. It is claimed that the PR gear surrounding the three acts as a shield and an amplifier. Strategic silence is weaponized, whereas purposeful disclosure manipulates public opinion. Every comment, post, and story contributes to the narrative architecture by reaffirming who is in control, who is vulnerable, and who is shielded. Tiny's prior indifference to 50 Cent's documentary references was indicative of this pattern. Observation, containment, and control over response. By remaining silent, she controlled how the events were ultimately portrayed, maintained her authority, and delayed passing judgment. Exposure is power, after all, and the individual utilizing controls the outcome. Money and branding raise these stakes. Fan interaction, collaborations, and sponsorships are purportedly based on perception rather than reality. The success of the industry depends on carefully chosen appearances. Loyalty denotes stability, relationships communicate influence, and controlled narrative preserves value. Tiny, Shekinah, and TI operate in the financial industry, where conflict is never impartial, silence is strategic, and transparency affects revenue and reputation. The public altercation, the leaked film, and Shekinah's eventual exposure are all transactions in this context. Moments when human suffering and economic stakes collide. Facilitators are considered to reinforce these dynamics. Observers in the inner circle often avoid intervention, provide selective background, or frame stories in order to adhere to prevailing systems. They deliberately remain silent, and is essential to maintaining the image of oneness. 4444 Every intentional phrase, every act of omission, and every fragment of adds to a controlled environment that limits transgression, upholds authority, and controls exposure. When the conflict with Shekinah started, the industry's machinery did not falter. The fundamental influence system was preserved while the effect was enhanced by simple recalibration. Social media is an omnipresent lens that magnifies every problem in modern architecture. It is believed that virality can be both a threat and a useful instrument. Leaks, videos, and conversations speed up perception management since they shape the narrative before official communications can respond. Each answer, or lack thereof, is scrutinized, interpreted, and utilized to maintain hierarchies. Shekinah's deliberate revelations, TI's selective involvement, and Tiny's restraint all interact with this digital environment to produce layers of moral judgment, suspicion, and interpretation that the viewer absorbs in real time. The intimate becomes public, and perception becomes reality. The existence of 50 Cent's hype documentary is thought to heighten the stakes above ordinary prominence. Millions are suddenly at risk of exposure due to subtle tactics, deliberate silences, and historical trends. The public scrutinizes every gesture, every private conversation, and every historical mistake. What was once controlled, buried, managed, or might now be uncontrollable. The industry's defenses, which were previously sufficient to manage consequences and regulate perception, now have to deal with an unpredictable variable. More narrative authority now belongs to those who are willing to confront, expose, and reveal the truth. Systemic consequences exist. Under public inspection, repeated acts in secret, displays of power, strategic restraint, and conditional loyalty are purportedly reframed. Fans, insiders, and the media increasingly view every interaction as evidence of broader dynamics including influence, control, and bargaining. Signaling hierarchies, conditional trust, and systemic enforcement mechanisms that control not only their personal lives but also industry behavior at large are all demonstrated by Tiny's assertion of authority, Shekinah's purposeful exposure, and TI's measured silence. The interplay between personal conflict and systemic protection is thought to highlight the fragility of well-crafted narratives. The struggle, which is initially private, spreads, challenging assumptions, disturbing perceptions, and revealing the mechanisms influencing behavior. Alliances disintegrate under scrutiny, reputations teeter under interpretation, and the appearance of togetherness steadily but inevitably falls. In this developing drama, every leaked video, social media echo, and public reaction becomes a vector, a reminder that disclosure is both a threat and a tool, silence is strategy, and image is cash. The concealed mechanism is eventually revealed and into the part. Shekinah's subsequent disclosure, the leaked video, and the altercation between Tiny Harris and Shekinah are not singular events. They serve as an illustration of an entire ecosystem in which leverage, influence, and strategic disclosure determine outcomes. Narrative control, selective visibility, and financial, social, and reputational stakes are said to come together to influence behavior, control perception, and uphold hierarchies. In this context, fallout is not a coincidence. It is deliberate, systemic, and inevitable. You are no longer merely an observer. Every detail, every film, every revelation between Tiny Harris, T, and Shekinah. Yes, I am important, and the story is shaped by your focus. The narrative is being told in real time, and silence equates to complicity. Patterns of control, leverage, and strategic disclosure are thought to have dominated these relationships for years. The public now has the opportunity to examine, assess, and respond to these trends. Your participation is not entirely optional. It is a component of the system that upholds accountability, truth, and perception. Discuss, argue, and analyze every viewpoint. Examine 55-55 motivations, inquire about timing, and think about the effects of actions that were previously concealed from view.